The operations room in Ouagadougou's military headquarters hummed with the sound of computers and radio chatter. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before a wall of monitors, his eyes scanning the incoming data from reconnaissance missions across the Northern Territories. At 37, he had already seen more conflict than most soldiers experience in a lifetime, fighting against JNIM militants who had turned vast swaths of Burkina Faso into contested ground. Lieutenant Amadou Kouanda approached with a tablet in hand, his expression tense. "Captain, we have something unusual from the drone surveillance over the Sahel region near Djibo." Traoré turned from the monitors, his military bearing evident in every movement. He had graduated with honors in geology from the University of Ouagadougou, knowledge that had proven invaluable in understanding how insurgents exploited the country's mineral-rich territories. "Show me." The lieutenant pulled up thermal imaging footage on the main screen. The video showed an aerial view of a desolate landscape, dotted with rocky outcroppings and dried riverbeds. But what caught Traoré's attention was a series of heat signatures emanating from what appeared to be natural cave formations in a hillside. "This area is supposed to be abandoned," Kouanda explained. "The mining companies pulled out 2 years ago when the insurgency intensified, but our drone detected movement, multiple heat signatures, and something else." He zoomed in on the footage. Vehicles, at least 3 trucks, partially concealed under camouflage netting. Traoré leaned closer to the screen, his mind racing through possibilities. The location was near one of Burkina Faso's Birimian greenstone belt formations, known for gold deposits that had made the country the 4th largest gold producer in Africa. Since taking leadership, he had made it a priority to nationalize mining operations and prevent foreign exploitation of the nation's resources. But the jihadists had found another way to profit from Burkina Faso's wealth. "Have we confirmed JNIM activity in this sector?" Traoré asked, referring to Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal Muslimin, the al-Qaeda affiliate that had become the deadliest threat in the Sahel. "Intelligence suggests increased movement in the past 3 weeks. Local villagers reported being forced to evacuate the area. Some mentioned hearing explosions underground." Kouanda pulled up a map showing the cave system. "Hi, Captain. If they're mining gold to fund their operations, then we need to know the full extent of it." Traoré straightened, his decision made. "Deploy another surveillance drone. I want continuous monitoring of that location, ground-penetrating radar if we have it available, and contact our intelligence network. I need to know if anyone has gone missing from the surrounding villages." As Kouanda moved to execute the orders, Traoré remained at the screen, studying the terrain. The cave entrance was barely visible, partially obscured by natural rock formations and desert vegetation. It was the perfect hiding place, remote enough to avoid casual detection, but accessible enough for regular operations. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from one of his field commanders. The text was brief but concerning. 3 families from Tongomayel reported missing, last seen being forced into trucks by armed militants 2 weeks ago. Traoré's jaw tightened. The jihadists weren't just stealing gold. They were enslaving people to extract it. This was bigger than he had initially thought. "Lieutenant," he called out, "assemble a briefing team. I want geological surveys of that area, satellite imagery from the past 6 months, and intelligence reports on all JNIM activities within a 50-kilometer radius. We meet in 2 hours." As the operations room mobilized around him, Traoré walked to the window overlooking Ouagadougou. The city stretched out below, a testament to Burkina Faso's resilience. Since taking power, he had worked tirelessly to distance the nation from foreign influence, particularly from France, and to build partnerships that served Burkina Faso's interests. He had nationalized gold mines, launched agricultural initiatives, and built a gold refinery to process the country's wealth domestically. But none of that mattered if citizens were being kidnapped and forced into slavery in underground mines. The very resources meant to build Burkina Faso's future were being stolen to finance its destruction. His phone rang. It was Colonel Diallo, his most trusted field commander currently stationed near Djibo. "Captain, we intercepted radio chatter. The militants are expecting a shipment. They mentioned cargo arriving at the cave site within 48 hours. "What kind of cargo?" Traoré asked. They didn't specify, but the context suggests either weapons or more prisoners. There was a pause. "Captain, if we're going to act, it needs to be soon. Once that shipment arrives, security at the site will be even tighter." Traoré made his decision. Start preparing for a possible operation. Quietly, I want your best team ready to move, but nobody moves until I give the word. We need more intelligence first. After ending the call, he returned to the monitors. The drone footage continued to stream in, showing the seemingly quiet hillside. But beneath that surface, in the darkness of those caves, people were suffering. His people. Chapter 2. Beneath the surface. Deep inside the cave system, 20 kilometers from where the drone circled overhead, Fatima Sawadago pressed her back against the cold stone wall, her breathing shallow in the thin air. The lantern hanging from a crude wooden beam cast dancing shadows across the rough-hewn tunnel, illuminating the faces of 7 other prisoners who sat in exhausted silence. Her hands were raw and bleeding from hours of chipping away at the rock face with a pickaxe. Gold dust glittered in the crevices she had exposed, beautiful and terrible at once. Each flake represented another day of captivity, another day stolen from her life and her 3 children who were somewhere above ground, guarded by militants who had threatened worse if she didn't work. "Drink this," whispered Burema, an older man from her village who had been taken in the same raid 2 weeks ago. He offered her a tin cup filled with murky water from a barrel the militants left for them each morning. "You need to keep your strength." Fatima took the cup with trembling hands. "How much longer can this continue? My children—" "I know," Burema said softly. He glanced toward the tunnel entrance where armed guards stood watch, AK-47s slung across their shoulders. "But we must endure. Others have been here longer. Some months." The revelation made Fatima's stomach turn. Months in this underground prison, breathing stale air thick with rock dust, working until exhaustion took over. She had heard the stories of JNEM's brutality, of villages burned and people killed, but she had never imagined this, systematic exploitation hidden beneath the earth. Chapter 3. The pattern emerges. Back in Ouagadougou, the briefing room filled with key personnel. Traoré stood at the head of the table, surrounded by military officers, intelligence analysts, and Dr. Hama Kabore, a geologist who had worked with him since his university days. "Show them what we found," Traoré instructed his intelligence officer, Major Zongo. The projector displayed a series of satellite images showing the cave area over the past 6 months. Zongo used a laser pointer to highlight key features. "Notice the pattern. Every 2 weeks, vehicle tracks appear leading to and from this location. The tracks are consistent with heavy trucks, the kind used for transporting ore or equipment." He switched to another image. "This is from 4 months ago. You can see fresh earth piled near the cave entrance, suggesting they've been expanding the tunnel system. And here," he zoomed in on a clearing a kilometer away, "what appears to be a makeshift processing area. They're not just extracting gold, they're refining it on site." "Doctor." Kabore stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "Captain Traoré asked me to analyze the geological formations in this area. Based on the satellite data and historical mining surveys, that cave system intersects with one of the richest gold veins in this region. The potential yield could be worth millions. Millions that fund weapons, vehicles, and operations against our people," Traoré said grimly. "Major, what do we know about the prisoners?" Zongo pulled up a list on the screen. "We've confirmed 12 families missing from 3 villages within 30 kilometers of the site. That's at least 40 individuals. Most are men of working age, but intelligence suggests women and some older teenagers were also taken. The militants are using family members as leverage. Work or your loved ones die." The room fell silent, the weight of that reality settling over everyone present. This wasn't just a military target. It was a rescue mission complicated by the presence of innocent civilians. Colonel Diallo, participating via video link from his forward position, spoke up. "Captain, I've been coordinating with our reconnaissance units. We've identified guard rotations, supply deliveries, and what appears to be a command post about 500 meters from the main cave entrance. The militants number around 20 to 30, well armed and organized." "Can we confirm how many prisoners?" Traoré asked. "Not yet, but based on the thermal imaging from today's drone sweep, we estimate at least 20 to 25 individuals inside the cave system at any given time. The problem is the layout. We don't have detailed maps of the tunnels. If we go in without knowing the full extent of the system, we risk trapping people inside or causing a cave-in." Traoré turned to Dr. Kabore. "Can we get those maps?" The geologist pulled up a dusty file on his laptop. I have partial surveys from when this was a legitimate mining operation, but they only cover the main shaft. The militants have clearly expanded beyond that. However, he highlighted several areas on the map. Based on the geology, there are likely only 2 or 3 viable routes through the system. The rock formations would make extensive tunneling extremely difficult without proper equipment, so they're working with what nature gave them, Traoré concluded. He studied the maps intently, his geological training allowing him to visualize the 3-dimensional structure of the cave system. These narrower passages here, they would make good choke points. If we could control these areas, we could segment the cave and prevent the militants from using the entire system for defense or escape. Lieutenant Kuanda raised a concern. Captain, even with detailed plans, a direct assault risks civilian casualties. The militants will use the prisoners as shields, which is why we won't begin with a direct assault, Traoré said. He turned to his communications officer. I want every available source of intelligence on this location. Intercept their radio communications, track their supply lines, identify their leaders. We need to understand their complete operation before we make our move. He looked around the room at his team, dedicated soldiers and civilians who had chosen to fight for Burkina Faso's future, despite overwhelming challenges. We have one chance to do this right. Those prisoners have families waiting for them, children who need their parents. This operation must be precise, calculated, and successful. Start planning for multiple scenarios, but nobody, and I mean nobody, moves until we have every piece of information we need. As the meeting dispersed, each person moving to their assigned tasks, Traoré remained in the briefing room, staring at the satellite images. Somewhere in those caves, people were suffering, working in darkness to extract the wealth of a nation they loved, forced to fund the very terror that held them captive. His phone buzzed with a message from his intelligence network. New information. Major JNIM Commander Al-Amin supervising cave operation, high-value target, estimated 28 prisoners confirmed, 3 guards at all times inside main shaft. Traoré saved the message and pulled up the maps again. Al-Amin was known to them, a ruthless commander responsible for multiple attacks across the Sahel region. His presence at the cave suggested this operation was more important to JNIM than they had initially assessed. The complexity of the situation was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about rescuing prisoners or stopping illegal mining. This was an opportunity to strike a significant blow against JNIM's financial network while saving innocent lives. But the margin for error was razor thin. Chapter 4. Inside the command post. Al-Amin sat in the makeshift command post, a reinforced structure built into a natural alcove in the hillside, studying reports from his subordinates. At 43, he had spent 2 decades fighting various battles across the Sahel, first in Mali, then expanding operations into Burkina Faso as opportunities arose. The cave mine had become his most profitable venture, a steady stream of gold that JNIM leadership used to purchase weapons, vehicles, and influence. How much did we extract this week? He asked his second-in-command, a younger militant named Yusuf. Nearly 15 kilograms of raw ore. The processing team estimates 8 kilograms of pure gold once refined. That's more than we projected. Yusuf consulted his notes. The prisoners are working efficiently. The threat against their families keeps them motivated. Al-Amin nodded, pleased. The operation had proven more successful than he had anticipated when they first discovered the abandoned mine shafts 6 months ago. The previous owners had barely scratched the surface of the deposit. With forced labor and no regard for safety regulations, they could extract far more. What about security? Al-Amin asked. Any signs of government forces in the area? Quiet. The nearest military patrol is stationed in Djibo, 35 kilometers away. They haven't shown any interest in this sector since we cleared out the villages. Don't underestimate Traoré, Al-Amin warned. He's different from the previous leaders. More aggressive, more willing to take risks. Make sure the guards stay alert. I want regular patrols around the perimeter, and keep the prisoners and families visible. If we're attacked, they're our insurance. He stood and walked to a crude map pinned to the wall, showing the cave system and surrounding territory. Red marks indicated guard positions, supply routes, and the locations where they held the prisoners, families. It was a network of control built on fear and exploitation. The next shipment goes out in 3 days, Al-Amin said. I want maximum security during the transfer. That gold is worth more than all our lives combined, and Janium leadership is counting on it to fund operations across the region. What Al-Amin didn't know was that at that very moment, 20 kilometers away, Traoré's intelligence team was intercepting every word of his radio communications, building a complete picture of the operation and identifying the exact timing for their next move. Chapter 5. The plan takes shape. 48 hours after the initial discovery, Traoré convened his core team in a secure planning room. The walls were covered with maps, photographs, and tactical diagrams showing every detail they had gathered about the cave site. "We now know the shipment leaves in 3 days, Traoré began, pointing to a timeline on the board. "Yes, that's when they'll be most vulnerable, distracted by moving the gold Asura with their attention divided between security and logistics. It's our window." Colonel Diallo nodded from his position at the front of the room. "My team has been training for cave operations. We have the equipment and expertise to navigate the tunnel system. But, Captain, the civilians complicate everything. If the militants realize we're coming, they could execute the prisoners or cause a collapse to trap everyone inside. Which is why we need a multi-phase approach," Traoré said. He pulled up a detailed tactical plan. Phase 1. We neutralize their external security and command posts simultaneously. This must be silent and complete. If even one militant gets a warning into the caves, we fail. He moved to the next section of the plan. Phase 2. A specialized team enters the cave system through the main entrance, while a second team blocks the rear exit we identified from the geological surveys. We move fast, using the element of surprise before the guards inside can organize a defense. Major Zongo added, "We've been monitoring their radio frequencies. Once we begin, we'll jam all their communications to prevent coordination between the guards in the cave and any external reinforcements." "What about the processing site?" asked Lieutenant Kuanda. "Do we secure that as well?" "Simultaneously," Traoré confirmed. 3 teams moving in coordination: command post, processing site, and cave entrance. The timing has to be perfect, within a 3-minute window. Any delay and we lose the advantage of surprise. Dr. Cabaret raised a concern. "Captain, I need to stress the danger of using explosives or heavy weapons inside the cave. The rock formations are stable, but not invulnerable. A misplaced round or grenade could trigger a collapse. Your teams need to use precision weapons only." "Noted," Traoré said. He turned to his medical officer. "Dr. Sankara, I want a medical team ready to treat the prisoners immediately upon extraction. Based on intelligence reports, they've been underground for weeks with minimal food, water, and no medical care. Some may need immediate attention." The planning continued for hours, each detail examined and refined. Supply chains, equipment checks, communication protocols, contingency plans for every possible complication. This was the kind of operation that required perfection. There were too many lives at stake to accept anything less. As the meeting concluded, Traoré gathered his team leaders. "I know what I'm asking of you. This is dangerous, complex, and there's no guarantee of success. But those people in that cave are our citizens. They were taken from their homes, forced into slavery, made to enrich the very organization that terrorizes our nation. If we don't stand for them, then everything we say about building a free and sovereign Burkina Faso is just words." Colonel Diallo stood at attention. "My team is ready, Captain. We'll bring them home." "All of you prepare your units," Traoré instructed. "We move in 2 days. Use the time to train, to check your equipment, to be ready for anything. And remember, the goal is to rescue the prisoners and neutralize the threat. The gold, the equipment, the militants, all secondary to bringing those people out alive." As his officers filed out to prepare their teams, Traoré remained in the planning room, studying the maps one more time. He had led soldiers in combat before, fought against insurgents in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. But this was different. This wasn't about holding territory or defeating an enemy in battle. This was about saving lives while simultaneously dismantling a terror network. His phone rang. It was his intelligence officer. "Captain, we have new information. One of the prisoners managed to mark the cave wall with information about the tunnel layout. Our source in the area photographed it. Sending it now." Traoré's screen lit up with an image of crude markings on stone, a map drawn by someone desperate to help their rescuers. It showed additional passages, guard positions, and most importantly, the location where the prisoners were held during their rest periods. He immediately forwarded the image to his tactical team with a message: "Update all plans. We now have inside intelligence. Adjust entry points and approach routes accordingly." This was the break they needed. Someone inside that cave was fighting back in the only way they could, leaving clues for the rescue they hoped would come. Traoré was determined not to let them down. Chapter 6. The Night Before. The military base outside Djibo was unusually quiet as night fell. Soldiers moved with purpose but spoke in hushed tones, checking weapons, testing communications equipment, reviewing maps by flashlight. Colonel Diallo walked among them, offering words of encouragement and last-minute instructions. In a separate tent, Traoré met with his closest advisors for a final review of the plan. The detailed timeline was projected on a screen, synchronized attacks beginning at 0400 hours, under cover of darkness, when the militants' alertness would be at its lowest. "Weather conditions are favorable," reported the operations officer. "No moon, light cloud cover. Our night vision equipment will give us a significant advantage. Medical teams are positioned 5 kilometers from the target site," Dr. Sankara added. "We have 3 ambulances and a field hospital ready to receive casualties." Traoré looked at the faces around him. People who had chosen to serve Burkina Faso, despite the dangers, despite the challenges, despite the doubts that outsiders expressed about their ability to secure their own nation. Since taking leadership, he had worked to build a military that served the people, not foreign interests. Tonight would test whether that vision could succeed. "I want to personally lead the cave entry team," Traoré announced. The room erupted in immediate objections. Colonel Diallo was the first to speak. "Captain, with all respect, you're too valuable to risk on a direct assault. If something happens, then my deputy takes command, just as he would if I were anywhere else," Traoré interrupted. "I studied geology. I understand cave systems. And more importantly, I will not ask soldiers to risk their lives while I remain safe at headquarters. Those prisoners need to see that their president stands with them, that Burkina Faso's leadership doesn't hide behind others when difficult work must be done." The silence that followed was heavy with concern, but also understanding. This was who Traoré was, a leader who had come up through the ranks, who had fought against insurgents, who had chosen to pursue a different path for Burkina Faso because he believed in the possibility of a nation that served its people rather than external powers. "Then I'm going with you," Colonel Diallo said firmly, "and I'm selecting the most experienced cave warfare specialists for your team. Captain, if you're going into those tunnels, you're going to have the best protection we can provide." Traoré nodded his acceptance. "Good. Then let's do final equipment checks. I want every soldier to understand their role, every contingency planned for. At 0400 tomorrow, we execute." As the meeting concluded, Traoré stepped outside the command tent and looked up at the stars visible through gaps in the clouds. Somewhere to the north, families waited desperately for news of their loved ones. Children wondered if their parents would return. Prisoners endured another night of captivity, not knowing if rescue would ever come. He thought about the words of Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader whose legacy still inspired Burkina Faso. Sankara had fought for sovereignty, for the right of Burkinabe people to control their own destiny. Traoré saw his own work as a continuation of that struggle, against terrorism, against foreign exploitation, against any force that sought to keep Burkina Faso from realizing its potential. This operation was more than a military action. It was a statement that Burkina Faso would protect its citizens, that its leaders would take personal risks for their people, that no one, not JNIM, not foreign powers, not anyone, would be allowed to enslave and exploit the nation's people or resources. Tomorrow they would see if that statement could be backed up with action. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue bringing you more content. Chapter 7. The Approach. At 0330 hours, 3 teams moved through the darkness toward their objectives. Traoré was with the cave entry team, 20 soldiers specially trained for close-quarters combat in confined spaces. They wore night vision goggles and carried suppressed weapons designed for precision rather than overwhelming firepower. Every piece of equipment had been checked and rechecked. They moved in complete silence across the desert landscape, using natural terrain features for cover. The drone continued its surveillance from high altitude, feeding real-time intelligence to the command center and to the soldiers. heads-up displays. Everything they had observed about the militants' patterns suggested the guards would be at their lowest alertness during these early morning hours. 2 kilometers from the target, the teams split into their designated approach vectors. Traoré's group headed toward the main cave entrance. A second team, led by Major Zongo, circled around to seal off the rear exit. The third team, commanded by Lieutenant Kuanda, prepared to assault the processing site and command post. "All units, this is Leopard 1. Traoré spoke quietly into his radio, using his call sign. "We are 15 minutes from objective. Maintain radio silence except for emergency traffic. Leopard 2, status." "Leopard 2 in position at secondary entrance," Major Zongo confirmed. "No movement detected." "Leopard 3 ready to advance on command post," Lieutenant Kuanda reported. Thermal imaging shows 6 targets inside the structure. The final approach was agonizingly slow, each step measured to avoid making noise that might alert the sentries. Through his night vision goggles, Traoré could see the cave entrance 200 meters ahead, partially obscured by rock formations. 2 guards stood visible, their weapons hanging loosely from straps, a sign of overconfidence or exhaustion. Colonel Diallo, moving alongside Traoré, signaled to his sniper teams. 2 soldiers dropped to prone positions, their suppressed rifles aimed at the guards. The timing would be critical. Both guards needed to be neutralized simultaneously before either could raise an alarm. "Leopard 1 to all units," Traoré whispered. "Prepare to execute on my mark. 3, 2, 1, execute." The night erupted into coordinated action. The sniper rounds found their targets with precision, both guards dropping silently. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Kuanda's team breached the command post, flashbangs and suppressed gunfire, taking down the militants before they could respond. At the processing site, another team secured the area and detained 3 workers found sleeping near the equipment. Traoré's team rushed forward to the cave entrance, moving fast now that surprise was achieved. They found 1 more guard inside the initial chamber, taken down before he could process what was happening. The team leader signaled all clear, and they began their descent into the tunnel system. The cave interior was exactly as the geological surveys had indicated, a natural formation expanded by human excavation. Support beams had been installed in some sections, but overall the tunnels were rough and unfinished. The air was thick with rock dust and the smell of sweat and fear. They moved deeper, following the map provided by the prisoner who had marked the walls. Every corner was approached with extreme caution, weapons ready but hoping not to need them. The goal was to secure the prisoners before the remaining guards could organize a defense. 200 meters into the tunnel system, they encountered the first imprisoned workers, a group of 5 men huddled in a side chamber, chained to iron rings bolted into the rock. The men looked up in terror as tactical lights illuminated them, expecting another brutal session with their captors. "Burkina Faso Armed Forces," Traoré said quietly, lowering his weapon. "You're being rescued. Stay calm and stay quiet." The relief on the men's faces was immediate and overwhelming. One began to weep silently as a soldier worked to cut through his chains. Another grabbed Traoré's arm. "My family. They have my family above ground. You have to save them." "Already done," Traoré assured him. Multiple teams secured all the locations. "Your families are safe." As 2 soldiers escorted the freed men back toward the entrance, the main team continued deeper into the cave. The tactical situation remained unclear. They had encountered fewer guards than expected inside the tunnel system. That meant either the intelligence had overestimated the numbers, or the guards were concentrated elsewhere. The answer came 3 chambers later, when they reached the main mining area. 8 militants had fortified themselves behind overturned carts and rock piles, using 15 prisoners as human shields. The standoff was exactly what Traoré had hoped to avoid. Al-Amin stood in the center of the makeshift barricade, holding a detonator connected to explosives placed throughout the chamber. "One step closer and I collapse this entire section," he shouted. "These people will be buried alive, along with you." Traoré assessed the situation quickly. The chamber was large, with multiple support beams showing signs of stress. Al-Amin wasn't bluffing. He had the means and apparently the willingness to bring the entire structure down. "Let the prisoners go," Traoré called back, his voice calm despite the tension. This doesn't have to end in more death." "You think I fear death?" Al-Amin laughed bitterly. "I've been fighting for 20 years. But you're Traoré, aren't you? the great revolutionary leading Burkina Faso to independence. Come to save your people personally." "That's right," Traoré confirmed, "and I'm prepared to negotiate their release. Whatever you want. I want you to leave, take your soldiers, and go. In exchange, I won't detonate these charges right now. I'll give the prisoners 12 hours before I do it. That's my offer." Traoré's mind raced through options. 12 hours meant Al-Amin would have time to bring in reinforcements, to turn this into a prolonged siege. But more importantly, it meant accepting the deaths of the prisoners he had come to save. There was no way Al-Amin intended to let them live. He needed to buy time for his team to find another angle of attack. Chapter 8. The Negotiation. "I need proof the charges are real," Traoré said, keeping Al-Amin engaged. "I'm not leaving until I know you're being honest about the explosives." Al-Amin pressed a button on the detonator, and a small controlled explosion echoed from a side tunnel, sending dust cascading down. "Satisfied? I have charges placed throughout this chamber. One signal and it all comes down." While Traoré kept Al-Amin talking, Colonel Diallo was coordinating with the team on a secondary approach. The map from the prisoner showed a narrow service tunnel that connected to the main chamber from above, barely wide enough for a single person to crawl through, but potentially offering an angle the militants wouldn't be watching. "How many prisoners do you have with you?" Traoré asked, trying to get an accurate count. "Enough. Men, women, children of the workers you already freed. All of them will die if you don't leave." That was a lie. Their intelligence indicated no children had been brought into the actual mining areas, though several had been held above ground with other family members. Al-Amin was trying to maximize the pressure, but the deception told Traoré something important. The militant commander was less confident than he appeared. "I studied geology at university," Traoré said conversationally, changing tactics. "Spent years learning about rock formations like this one. You know what I learned? Explosives in confined spaces are unpredictable. You might bring down just this chamber, or you might trigger a chain reaction that buries you as well. That detonator you're holding, it's as much a threat to you as it is to us." For the first time, uncertainty crossed Al-Amin's face. Traoré pressed the advantage. "Your operation here is finished. We've seized the processing site, arrested your people at the command post, and secured all the prisoners' families you were using as leverage. The gold you were planning to ship out, it's ours now. You have nothing to gain from detonating those charges except your own death." "Then we die as martyrs," Al-Amin declared, but his grip on the detonator had shifted, no longer confident, now tense. Through his earpiece, Traoré heard Colonel Diallo's whispered update. "Team in position above the chamber. 3 shooters with clear angles, waiting for your signal." Traoré needed to create one more distraction, something to draw Al-Amin's attention away from his defensive position, long enough for the sniper team to act. "I'll make you an offer," he said. "Let the prisoners go, and you and your men can leave through the rear tunnel. My word as an officer, we won't pursue for 24 hours. It was a bluff. Major Zongo's team was positioned to prevent exactly that escape route, but Al-Amin didn't know that. What he did know was that he was trapped, outnumbered, and running out of options. "You expect me to trust the word of a military commander?" Al-Amin scoffed, but he had turned slightly, gesturing to his men, discussing the possibility in hushed tones. That was the opening Traoré had been waiting for. He spoke one word into his radio: "Execute." 3 suppressed shots cracked through the chamber. Al-Amin's hand jerked away from the detonator as a bullet struck his shoulder. 2 other militants dropped. The remaining guards, seeing their commander wounded and their position compromised, began to surrender. Traoré's team rushed forward, securing the detonator and disarming the remaining militants. Colonel Diallo dropped down from the access tunnel above, his sniper team following. In less than 3 minutes, the standoff was over. The freed prisoners huddled together, traumatized but alive. Fatima Sawadogo was among them, her eyes wide with disbelief as soldiers cut through her chains. "Is it real?" she whispered. "Are we actually being rescued?" "It's real," Traoré assured her, helping her to her feet. "You're safe now, all of you." Medical teams rushed in to attend to the wounded. Prisoners and militants alike received treatment, though priorities went to those who had been held captive. Traoré made sure each freed prisoner was accounted for, their names checked against the list of missing persons his intelligence team had compiled. Dr. Sankara moved among them, assessing injuries and dehydration. Most of them need immediate IV fluids and treatment for malnutrition. Some have infected wounds from the mining work, but they'll recover, physically at least. The psychological trauma will take longer. As the evacuation began, Traoré walked through the mining chamber, observing the operation the militants had established. Crude equipment, dangerous conditions, no safety measures whatsoever. The amount of gold they had extracted was substantial, refined bars stacked in a secure chamber, ready for transport. This represented months of forced labor, stolen wealth meant to fund terrorism across the Sahel. "Captain," Lieutenant Kuanda called from a side passage, "you need to see this." Traoré followed him into a smaller chamber where they had found records, notebooks documenting the entire operation, names of prisoners, amounts of gold extracted, schedules for shipments, and most importantly, names and contacts for JNIM's broader network of financing. "This is intelligence gold," Kuanda said. "We can trace where the money was going, who was buying the gold, how the financing network operates. This could help dismantle operations across multiple countries." Traoré carefully photographed each page, making sure every detail was preserved. This rescue operation had just become something much larger, a window into JNIM's financial infrastructure that could impact their operations throughout the entire Sahel region. Chapter 9. The Aftermath. Dawn was breaking as the last of the prisoners emerged from the cave, supported by soldiers and medical personnel. A line of ambulances waited to transport them to hospitals in Ouagadougou, where they would receive proper treatment. Families who had been held above ground as hostages were reunited with their loved ones, tears of relief flowing freely. Fatima Sawadogo held her children tightly, unable to speak through her sobs. Her husband, who had also been held in the mines, wrapped his arms around all of them, creating a circle of protection and love. Around them, similar scenes played out. Families torn apart by terrorism, being brought back together by soldiers who had risked everything to make it possible. Traoré watched from a distance, his military bearing not quite hiding the emotion he felt. This was what Burkina Faso should be, a nation that protected its people, that fought for their freedom, that refused to accept exploitation as inevitable. Colonel Diallo approached, removing his tactical helmet. Final count: 28 prisoners rescued, all alive. 8 militants captured, including Al-Amin. He'll survive his wounds and face trial. No casualties among our forces, though 3 soldiers sustained minor injuries during the breach. "And the intelligence materials?" Traoré asked. "Secured, and being transported to headquarters. The amount of information we recovered is substantial. Financial records, communication logs, operational plans. This is going to create shockwaves through JNIM's entire network." As the morning sun climbed higher, additional military units arrived to secure the site and begin the process of cataloging everything they had seized. The gold would be transported to Burkina Faso's national refinery, where it would be processed and used to fund development projects, schools, hospitals, infrastructure. Resources that had been stolen would now serve the purpose they should have all along. News crews arrived by mid-morning, though they were kept at a distance from the actual site. Traoré agreed to a brief statement, standing before the cameras with the cave entrance visible in the background. "Today, the people of Burkina Faso witnessed what is possible when we fight for our sovereignty," he began. 28 of our citizens were being held in slavery, forced to extract our nation's wealth to fund terrorism. They are now free, returned to their families, receiving medical care. The militants responsible are in custody. The gold they stole is recovered, and the intelligence we gathered will help us combat terrorism not just in Burkina Faso, but across the entire Sahel region. He paused, his expression serious. This operation demonstrates several truths. First, that Burkina Faso will not tolerate the exploitation of our people or our resources. Second, that our military is capable, committed, and willing to take risks to protect citizens. And third, that we will continue to fight for true independence, freedom from terrorism, freedom from foreign exploitation, freedom to build the nation our people deserve. Later that day, back at military headquarters in Ouagadougou, Traoré convened a meeting of his key advisors to discuss next steps. The recovered intelligence had revealed connections that extended beyond Burkina Faso's borders, implicating networks in Mali and Niger as well. We need to share this information with our allies in the Alliance of Sahel States, Traoré decided. If JNIM is running similar operations in Mali and Niger, those governments need to know. This is bigger than one cave mine. It's a systematic network of exploitation. His foreign ministry representative nodded. I'll coordinate with Mali and Niger immediately. This could be the basis for joint operations. What about the prisoners? Dr. Sankara asked. Beyond the immediate medical treatment, they'll need psychological support, potentially job training to help them rebuild their lives. Make it a priority, Traoré instructed. These people endured trauma serving as forced labor. The least we can do is ensure they have the resources to recover and thrive. I want a comprehensive support program developed. Medical care, counseling, job training, financial assistance for their families during recovery. As the meeting continued, mapping out the various implications and responses, Traoré's phone buzzed with messages from regional leaders, offering congratulations and requesting information about the operation. The successful rescue had resonated beyond Burkina Faso's borders, a rare good news story in a region plagued by bad ones. But Traoré knew the celebration would be brief. JNIM remained a threat. Terrorism continued to destabilize the Sahel, and the work of building a truly free and prosperous Burkina Faso was far from complete. This operation was one victory in a much longer struggle. Chapter 10. The Prisoners. Stories. 3 days after the rescue, Fatima Sawadogo sat in a hospital room in Ouagadougou, her arms and hands bandaged, an IV providing the nutrients her body desperately needed. A psychologist sat across from her, notebook in hand, gently helping her process the trauma of her captivity. "I thought we would die in there," Fatima said quietly. "Every day, chipping away at rock, breathing dust, wondering if the tunnel would collapse. But the fear of what they would do to my children if I stopped working, that was worse than anything else." The psychologist, Dr. Zoe Ouedraogo, listened patiently. She had been working with all the rescued prisoners, helping them begin the long process of healing. Each story was unique in its details, but united by common threads of fear, resilience, and the desperate hope that somehow, someone would come for them. "The moment I saw the soldiers," Fatima continued, tears streaming down her face, "I couldn't believe it. I thought maybe I had died, that it was some kind of dream before the end. But then Captain Traoré spoke to us, told us we were safe, and I realized it was real. Someone actually came for us." Down the hall, other prisoners were telling similar stories to medical staff, journalists, and family members. Burema, the older man who had shared water with Fatima in the cave, explained to his grandchildren how he had used a sharp rock to mark the cave walls with a map, hoping someone would find it and use it to help rescue them. "I wasn't sure it would work," he admitted, "but I had to try something. We all felt so helpless down there. Making that map, it gave me purpose, something to focus on besides the fear." His grandson, a teenager named Musa, listened with wide eyes. "You're a hero, grandfather. You helped save everyone." "No," Burema shook his head firmly. "The heroes are the soldiers who came into that cave, not knowing what they would find, risking their lives for us. Captain Traoré himself was there, can you imagine? The president of our country, in the tunnels with us. That's what gave me hope for Burkina Faso's future." The stories spread through Ouagadougou and beyond, shared on social media, discussed in markets and homes across the country. For many Burkinabe, the rescue operation represented something they had not felt in years: pride in their military, confidence in their leadership, and hope that perhaps their nation could overcome the challenges it faced. International media picked up the story as well, though their coverage was mixed. Some praised the successful operation and the message it sent about African nations taking control of their own security. Others questioned the lack of Western involvement, suggesting the operation had been reckless or that more prisoners might have been saved with international support. Traoré addressed these criticisms during a radio interview. "We are grateful for genuine partnerships built on respect and mutual benefit," he said. "But Burkina Faso does not need permission or oversight to protect our own citizens." The implication that African militaries cannot execute complex operations without foreign supervision is itself a form of colonialism. We proved that assumption wrong. Chapter 11. The Trial. 6 weeks after the rescue, Al-Amin and his captured militants faced trial in Ouagadougou. The proceedings were held publicly, broadcast to the nation, as testimony from the rescued prisoners detailed the conditions they had endured. Fatima Sawadogo took the stand, her voice strong despite the emotion of recounting her experience. They treated us like tools, not human beings. My value was measured only in how much gold I could extract. My children were held as insurance that I would comply. For 2 weeks, I worked until my hands bled, breathing air so thick with dust I could barely draw breath, always wondering if that day would be the day they decided we were no longer useful. The judges listened intently as witness after witness described the systematic exploitation, the threats against families, the complete disregard for safety or human dignity. The militants' legal representatives tried to argue that they were soldiers fighting for a cause, but the evidence was overwhelming. This was not warfare, it was slavery and theft on a massive scale. Al-Amin remained defiant throughout the trial. "You call me a terrorist, but you are the ones who sold your country to foreigners. You took their money, their weapons, their support, and wondered why your people suffered. Jainim fights for Islamic governance, for resistance against Western imperialism. The gold we extracted was funding jihad across Africa." Traoré attended portions of the trial, wanting to witness justice being served for the victims. When Al-Amin made his statements about fighting imperialism, Traoré felt compelled to respond during a press conference afterward. "The man on trial speaks of fighting imperialism while enslaving his own people," Traoré said. "He claims to resist Western influence while funding his operations by stealing African resources. That is not anti-imperialism. That is hypocrisy of the worst kind. True resistance to exploitation means building systems that serve our people, not terrorizing them. It means taking control of our resources for our benefit, not stealing them to buy weapons. Jainim's actions are not resistance. They are oppression wearing the mask of ideology." The trial concluded with guilty verdicts on all charges: kidnapping, forced labor, theft of national resources, terrorism, and conspiracy. Al-Amin received a life sentence. His co-defendants received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. For the victims and their families present in the courtroom, the verdicts brought a measure of closure, though all understood the psychological scars would take much longer to heal. Outside the courthouse, Bourema spoke to gathered journalists. "Justice was served today, but more important than punishment is what happens next. Will our government continue to protect us? Will they prevent this from happening to others? That's the real test." Traoré, watching the coverage from his office, knew Bourema was right. The rescue operation and subsequent trial were significant achievements, but they were not endpoints. They were demonstrations of what was possible, a template for how Burkina Faso could protect its people and resources. Now came the harder work of building systems and institutions that could sustain that protection over time. Chapter 12. Moving forward. 3 months after the rescue, a ceremony was held in Ouagadougou to commemorate the operation and honor those who had participated. The rescued prisoners stood on a platform before a crowd of thousands, finally healthy. Their physical wounds healed even as the emotional ones continued to mend. Captain Traoré presented medals to the soldiers who had executed the operation, recognizing their skill and courage. Colonel Diallo, Major Zongo, Lieutenant Kouanda, and dozens of others received commendations for their roles in planning and executing the rescue. But the most emotional moment came when Bourema stepped forward to present a gift to the military, a detailed carving of the cave system, complete with the map he had etched into the walls. "This is our reminder," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "A reminder that in darkness, we must create our own light. In captivity, we must plan our own freedom. And when help comes, we must be ready to aid our rescuers." The gold recovered from the cave had been processed at Burkina Faso's national refinery, just as Traoré had promised. 50% was designated for a victim compensation fund, ensuring the rescued prisoners and their families received financial support during their recovery. The remainder went into a security development fund, used to improve equipment and training for military operations against terrorism. The intelligence gathered from the cave site had proven even more valuable than initially estimated. Working with allies in Mali and Niger, security forces had dismantled 3 additional JNIM financial networks, seized several other illicit mining operations, and arrested key figures in the terrorist organization's supply chain. The impact rippled across the Sahel region, disrupting operations that had fueled violence for years. Fatima Sawadogo had used her compensation to start a small business, selling textiles in Ouagadougou's markets. She stood among the crowd at the ceremony, her children beside her, watching as Traoré spoke about the future. This operation was successful because we believed in ourselves, Traoré told the assembled crowd. We believed that Burkina Faso has the capability, the expertise, and the determination to protect our own people. We believed that our resources belong to us, and that we have both the right and the responsibility to defend them. And we believed that African solutions to African problems are not just possible, they are necessary. He paused, looking out at the faces before him. Soldiers, former prisoners, families, citizens who had gathered to celebrate this victory. But we cannot stop here. JNIM remains active. Terrorism continues to threaten our region. Foreign interests still seek to exploit our resources. The work of building a truly free and prosperous Burkina Faso requires constant vigilance, constant effort, constant belief in what we can achieve. The crowd erupted in applause, and for a moment, the challenges facing Burkina Faso seemed surmountable, not easy, but possible, not guaranteed, but worth fighting for. Later that evening, Traoré stood on the balcony of the presidential residence, looking out over Ouagadougou as the sun set. His phone buzzed with reports from military commanders in the field, new intelligence about potential threats, updates on security operations, requests for resources and support. The work never stopped. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. 28 people were alive because his soldiers had been willing to risk everything to save them. A terrorist network had been disrupted. Burkina Faso's resources had been recovered and put to use, serving the nation's people. It wasn't everything he wanted to achieve for his country, but it was something. It was progress. Colonel Diallo joined him on the balcony, holding 2 cups of hot Ataya tea. "Thinking about the next operation already?" he asked, handing 1 cup to Traoré. "Always," Traoré admitted with a slight smile, "but also thinking about how far we've come. 2 years ago, many people said Burkina Faso couldn't succeed without foreign military support, that we weren't capable of handling our own security. Operations like this prove them wrong. It's changing perceptions," Diallo agreed. "Not just internationally, but among our own people. They're starting to believe again in themselves, in their country, in the possibility of a better future." That belief, Traoré reflected, was perhaps the most important outcome of the entire operation. More than the rescued prisoners, more than the seized gold, more than the disrupted terrorist network, the restoration of hope and pride among the Burkinabe people was the true victory. The road ahead remained difficult. Terrorism would not be defeated by a single operation. No matter how successful, economic challenges persisted. International pressure continued from various directions. But Burkina Faso had proven something fundamental, that African nations could take responsibility for their own security, protect their own people, and control their own resources. As the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear, Traoré finished his tea and prepared to return to his office. There were reports to read, decisions to make, plans to refine. The work of building a sovereign and prosperous Burkina Faso continued, but for this one evening, he allowed himself to feel what those he had rescued felt, hope that tomorrow could be better than today, and confidence that with determination and courage, that hope could become reality. The drone footage that had started everything, grainy thermal images of movement in a cave, had led to the freedom of 28 people and dealt a significant blow to terrorism in the Sahel. It was a reminder that every piece of intelligence mattered, that every life was worth fighting for, and that leadership meant being willing to take personal risks for the people you served. Traoré returned to his office, ready to continue the work. Behind him, Ouagadougou settled into its evening rhythms, a city and a nation still facing enormous challenges, but also a nation that had proven, at least for one operation, that those challenges could be overcome. The story of the cave rescue would be told and retold, inspiring others to believe in what was possible when people refused to accept exploitation, when soldiers valued every citizen's life, and when leaders chose to fight alongside their people rather than above them. In the end, that was the lesson carried forward from the caves in the northern desert, that Burkina Faso's future, would be determined not by outside forces, but by the courage and determination of its own people to build the nation they believed in. Towards the end, epilogue. 6 months had passed since the rescue operation that captured international attention and transformed the lives of 28 people who had endured unspeakable conditions in the darkness beneath Burkina Faso's northern territories. The sun rose over Ouagadougou on a Saturday morning, casting golden light across the capital city as it awakened to another day of progress and challenges intertwined in the complex reality of building a nation. Fatima Sawadogo adjusted the colorful fabrics displayed at her market stall, her hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the scars that still marked her palms, permanent reminders of the rock and pickaxes that had torn her skin during those terrible weeks underground. Her textile business had grown beyond her initial expectations, supported by the compensation fund and by customers who specifically sought out her stall because they knew her story, because they wanted to support someone who had survived and was rebuilding. "Mama, can I help arrange the cloths?" her youngest daughter asked, reaching for a bolt of indigo fabric printed with traditional Burkinabe patterns. Fatima smiled, a gesture that came more easily now than it had in those first weeks after the rescue, when every shadow seemed threatening, when every loud noise sent her heart racing with remembered terror. "Yes, my dear. Put the bright colors at the front. They catch people's eyes as they walk past." Her daughter worked carefully, and Fatima watched her with profound gratitude. During those dark days in the cave, when exhaustion and despair had threatened to overwhelm her, the thought of her children had been what kept her chipping away at the rock, what prevented her from giving up entirely. Now, watching her daughter help with the business, seeing her smile without fear, made every moment of that suffering feel survivable because they had come through to the other side. A customer approached, examining the fabrics with interest, as Fatima engaged in the familiar dance of negotiation, discussing quality, suggesting combinations. Arriving at a price that satisfied both parties, she reflected on how far she had traveled from that cave. The weekly counseling sessions with Dr. Ouedraogo had helped her process the trauma, teaching her techniques to manage the anxiety that still sometimes gripped her unexpectedly. The support group for rescued prisoners met every Tuesday, a space where they could share their experiences with others who truly understood. Bourema had become something of a local celebrity in his village, though he deflected the attention with characteristic humility. His carved map of the cave system now resided in Burkina Faso's National Museum, labeled as an artifact of resistance and hope. School groups visited to hear him speak about those weeks underground, about the importance of never giving up, even when circumstances seemed hopeless. He told them about marking the walls, about creating the map that would eventually help their rescuers navigate the tunnels, about how small acts of courage could have enormous consequences. His grandson Musa had been inspired to join the military, specifically requesting assignment to the intelligence division, where he hoped to work on counter-terrorism operations. Bourema had mixed feelings about this decision: pride that his grandson wanted to serve Burkina Faso, worry about the dangers such service entailed, but he understood the motivation. The rescue had shown an entire generation that their country was worth fighting for, that their leaders were willing to put themselves at risk for ordinary citizens. At military headquarters, Captain Ibrahim Traoré reviewed the morning intelligence briefings with his characteristic focus and intensity. The operation that had rescued the cave prisoners had indeed created ripple effects throughout the Sahel region, disrupting JNEM's financial networks in ways that continued to manifest months later. But terrorism adapted, found new methods, sought new opportunities. The struggle was far from over. "Captain, we have reports of unusual activity near the Mali border," Major Zongo briefed, pointing to a map displaying the latest surveillance data. "Increased vehicle movements, possible establishment of a new base camp. The pattern is similar to what we saw before they established the cave operation." Traoré studied the information carefully, his geological training helping him assess the terrain and identify potential sites that could be exploited. "Increased drone surveillance in that sector, coordinate with our Malian counterparts through the Alliance of Sahel States framework. If they're trying to establish another operation, I want to know about it before they can entrench themselves." Colonel Diallo entered the room, carrying additional files. "Captain, I have the quarterly report on the victim support program. All 28 rescued prisoners are receiving ongoing medical and psychological care. 15 have returned to work in various capacities. 8 are in vocational training programs, and 5 are continuing recovery with full disability support. Good, Traoré said, genuinely pleased. The commitment to care for those they had rescued was as important to him as the operation itself had been. What about their children? The educational support we promised? All enrolled in schools with full scholarships funded by the Security Development Program. Several have expressed interest in military or public service careers when they're older. Diallo paused, then added, "The operation continues to pay dividends in ways we didn't initially anticipate. Recruitment applications have increased 30%, particularly from young people citing the rescue mission as inspiration. They want to be part of something that protects Burkinabe citizens." This was perhaps the most significant long-term impact of the operation, not just the tactical success or the disrupted terrorist networks, but the restoration of belief among Burkina Faso's people that their institutions could work, that their leaders valued them, that their nation was worth serving and protecting. Traoré had always understood that true security came not just from military strength, but from the legitimacy and trust that arose when governments actually served their citizens' interests. His phone rang with an encrypted call from the president of Niger. "Captain Traoré, I wanted to update you on the joint operation we discussed. Using the intelligence from your cave site, our forces raided 3 locations along our shared border. We rescued 11 prisoners being held in similar conditions and seized approximately 22 kilograms of gold. This model of cooperation within the Alliance of Sahel states is proving effective." "That's excellent news," Traoré responded. "Regional coordination is essential if we're going to address terrorism comprehensively. JNIM doesn't respect borders, neither can our response." After the call ended, Traoré walked to the window overlooking the city. Ouagadougou stretched before him, a mixture of modern construction and traditional architecture, of aspiration and reality, of challenges and possibilities. Since taking leadership of Burkina Faso, he had pursued a vision of sovereignty that meant more than just political independence. It meant economic self-determination, security controlled by Burkinabés for Burkinabe interests, and a rejection of the neo-colonial patterns that had kept African nations dependent on former colonial powers. The cave rescue had become a symbol of that vision made real. When international critics had questioned whether Burkina Faso could execute such a complex operation without Western military support, the successful mission had provided a definitive answer. When skeptics had suggested that African militaries lacked the capability for sophisticated counter-terrorism work, the precision and planning of the operation had proven otherwise. But Traoré knew that symbols alone didn't build nations. The real work was in the daily grind of governance, allocating resources efficiently, training soldiers effectively, developing economic opportunities, providing education and healthcare, building infrastructure that served citizens rather than exploiting them. The cave rescue was one success in an ongoing struggle that would continue long after he left office. At the gold refinery, he had established to process Burkina Faso's mineral wealth domestically, rather than shipping raw materials abroad for others to profit from. Workers processed ore into pure gold bars, stamped with the national seal. The facility had become a point of pride, demonstrating that Burkina Faso could add value to its own resources rather than accepting the role of mere extraction site for foreign benefit. The manager, a Burkinabe engineer named Aminata Compaoré, oversaw operations with meticulous attention to detail. Some of the gold being processed today came from legitimate mining operations, properly taxed and regulated, but a portion came from recovered JNIM sites, wealth that had been stolen now being transformed into resources for schools, hospitals, and infrastructure projects across the nation. "We're currently processing at 73% capacity," Aminata reported during her weekly update to the Ministry of Mines. "With the recovered gold from joint operations with Mali and Niger, we're projecting a 15% increase in revenue allocation for the Victim Support Fund and Security Development Program." The interconnected nature of these initiatives, security operations funding development, development creating stability, stability enabling economic growth, represented the kind of holistic approach Traoré believed was necessary for real progress. Too often, African nations had been told to choose between security and development, between economic growth and social welfare. Burkina Faso was attempting to demonstrate that these weren't contradictory goals, but complementary ones. In the prison where Al-Amin and his co-defendants served their sentences, the former JNIM commander reflected on his choices with the bitter awareness that comes from total defeat. He had believed his cause was righteous, that stealing from the Burkinabe state to fund jihad was justified by higher religious and political principles. The trial and imprisonment had not changed his fundamental beliefs, but they had forced him to confront the reality that his methods had failed. Other inmates, some imprisoned for different crimes, sometimes asked him about his experiences fighting across the Sahel. Al-Amin had become a cautionary tale even among the prison population, a reminder that ideology without practical success was just noise, that military operations that alienated the very populations you claimed to represent were doomed to failure. "You enslaved your own people," one inmate challenged during a yard conversation, called it resistance, but it was just theft and cruelty with religious language wrapped around it. "How is that different from what you accuse the government of doing?" Al-Amin had no good answer, and his silence spoke volumes. The sophisticated arguments that had justified his actions in the field seemed hollow in the harsh light of imprisonment and defeat. JNIM's ideology had promised liberation, but delivered only more suffering to the communities it claimed to champion. Back in her village, now secured by regular military patrols that made residents feel protected rather than threatened, a teacher named Salimata Ouedraogo taught a classroom of children about Burkina Faso's history and geography. When she reached the section on natural resources, she no longer had to explain why Burkina Faso's gold enriched other nations while its own people remained poor. She could talk about the national refinery, about resources being used for Burkinabe benefit, about a government attempting to build genuine sovereignty. "Our gold belongs to us," she told her students, pointing to a map showing mineral deposits across the country, not to foreign companies, not to terrorists, but to the people of Burkina Faso. "When we protect our resources and use them wisely, we create opportunities for all of you. Schools, hospitals, roads, businesses. That's what sovereignty really means." One student raised her hand. "My uncle was one of the people rescued from the cave. He says Captain Traoré came into the tunnels himself to save them. Is that true?" Salimata nodded. "Yes, it's true. Our president understood that leadership means being willing to take the same risks you ask others to take. It means your people's lives matter enough that you'll personally ensure their safety." This was the narrative being taught to a new generation, not blind nationalism or uncritical praise of leadership, but a more nuanced understanding of what governance could be when it prioritized citizens over external interests, when it valued sovereignty not as an abstract principle, but as practical commitment to self-determination. Dr. Zoe Ouedraogo, the psychologist who had worked with the rescued prisoners, prepared a report on their long-term recovery for submission to the Ministry of Health. Her findings were cautiously optimistic. With proper support, most of the survivors were rebuilding their lives successfully. The trauma remained, would always remain in some form, but it no longer defined them entirely. They had survived, and survival had meaning because they were being given the resources and support to move forward. "The most significant factor in their recovery," she wrote in her conclusion, "has been the societal response to their experience. Rather than being forgotten or stigmatized, they have been recognized, supported, and integrated into national narratives of resilience. This social validation of their suffering and survival has accelerated healing in ways that clinical intervention alone could not achieve. It was a lesson about trauma and recovery, but also about governance and responsibility. When a state acknowledged its citizens' suffering and took concrete action to address it, the relationship between people and government could be transformed from one of cynical distance to active partnership." As evening approached, Fatima finished her day at the market, counting her earnings with satisfaction. It had been a good day, several large sales, many smaller ones, and conversations with customers who were becoming regulars. Her daughter helped pack away the remaining fabrics, already talking about what they would prepare for dinner. Walking home through Ouagadougou's busy streets, Fatima passed a newsstand displaying the day's headlines. One caught her eye: "Regional Cooperation Rescues 11. More prisoners. Alliance of Sahel States Operation uses Burkina Faso model." She smiled slightly. knowing that the terrible experience she had endured had somehow contributed to saving others, that the map Burema had etched into stone walls had become a template for identifying and rescuing victims of similar exploitation. Her trauma was real and ongoing, something she worked through every day with varying degrees of success. But it existed alongside pride. Pride that she had survived, pride that her country had come for her, pride that her experience was helping build a better Burkina Faso for her children. That evening, Traoré hosted a small dinner at the presidential residence for key members of the rescue operation team. It wasn't a formal ceremony, but rather an informal gathering of people who had worked together on something significant and wanted to mark its ongoing impact. Colonel Diallo, Major Zongo, Lieutenant Kuanda, Dr. Sankara, and several others gathered around a table laden with traditional Burkinabe dishes. 6 months ago, we didn't know if the operation would succeed, Diallo said, raising his glass. So we had a plan, training and determination, but we also had uncertainty. 28 lives depended on us getting everything right. And we did, Kuanda added. Not perfectly. There were complications, moments where things could have gone wrong. But we adapted. We trusted each other. And we achieved our objective. Traoré listened to his team reflect on the operation, hearing in their words not just pride, but also the weight of responsibility they had felt. These were serious people doing difficult work, and the success of one operation did not erase the ongoing challenges they faced. But it provided evidence that success was possible, that competent planning and execution could overcome seemingly impossible situations. What matters most, Traoré said when it was his turn to speak, is that 28 people are alive and rebuilding their lives. Everything else, the seized gold, the disrupted networks, the international attention, all secondary to that fundamental fact. We went into those caves for people, and we brought people out. That's the measure of success. Dr. Sankara nodded in agreement. And the ongoing support we've provided them shows that the rescue wasn't the end of our responsibility, but the beginning. That's what distinguishes this operation. Not just the tactical execution, but the comprehensive commitment to the welfare of those we rescued. As the dinner continued, conversation ranged across various topics: upcoming operations, regional security challenges, political developments in neighboring countries, the constant work of governance and military readiness. But underneath all of it was a shared understanding that they were part of something larger than individual careers or ambitions. They were attempting to build a Burkina Faso that worked for its people, that protected its citizens, that controlled its resources, that demonstrated sovereignty was more than just a word. Later that night, after his guests had departed, Traoré stood on the balcony overlooking Ouagadougou, the city lights spreading before him like a constellation of possibilities. His phone buzzed with the inevitable stream of reports, updates, and requests that defined leadership. He would review them all, make decisions, provide guidance, and then wake up the next morning to do it again. This was the reality of governance, not dramatic rescue operations captured in headlines, but the daily work of building institutions, training soldiers, allocating resources, making compromises, pushing forward despite setbacks. The cave rescue would be remembered as a defining moment, but Burkina Faso's future would be determined by thousands of smaller decisions and actions, by the accumulated choices of millions of citizens working to build the nation they believed in. Somewhere in the northern territories, drones continued their surveillance patterns, feeding data to analysts who searched for signs of threat or exploitation. The work of security never stopped, the vigilance never ended, but now there was precedent, a proven model for responding when threats were identified. The cave operation had established that Burkina Faso could protect its own, and that knowledge created both confidence and responsibility. Fatima tucked her children into bed that night, kissing their foreheads and saying prayers for their safety and happiness. She still sometimes woke from nightmares of the cave, still felt phantom aches in her scarred hands, still experienced moments of anxiety when confined spaces triggered memories, but she also felt hope, real, tangible hope that her children would grow up in a Burkina Faso that was safer, more prosperous, more just than the one she had known. That hope was what the rescue had really been about. Not just freeing 28 people from physical captivity, but freeing an entire nation from the psychological captivity of believing they were helpless, that they needed foreign saviors. that their government couldn't or wouldn't protect them. The cave operation had shattered those assumptions, proving that Burkina Faso had the capability, the will, and the leadership to defend its people and resources. As Traoré finally turned from the balcony and headed to bed, he allowed himself one last thought before sleep. That 6 months from now, or 6 years, or 60 years, the story of the cave rescue would still be told. Not because it was the most dramatic military operation or the most complex rescue mission, but because it represented a moment when Burkina Faso demonstrated who it wanted to be, a nation that valued every citizen, that fought for sovereignty not as abstraction, but as practical reality, that believed its future belonged to its people. The drone that had detected movement in that cave had been doing its job, executing routine surveillance. The soldiers who had responded had been doing their jobs, following training and orders. The intelligence analysts, the medical teams, the support personnel, all had been doing their jobs. But collectively, they had accomplished something more than the sum of those individual duties. They had rescued people who had lost hope, disrupted networks that financed terror, and demonstrated that African solutions to African problems weren't just aspirational rhetoric, but achievable reality. And tomorrow, they would wake up and continue the work, because building a nation was not a single operation, but a continuous commitment. The cave rescue was one chapter in a much longer story, the story of Burkina Faso claiming its sovereignty, protecting its people, and building the future its citizens deserved. That story was still being written, would continue to be written by generations yet to come, but it now included this chapter of courage, competence, and commitment to the principle that every citizen's life mattered enough to risk everything to protect it. In the darkness beneath the northern territories, the caves remained empty now of prisoners and gold, silent monuments to suffering and survival. Eventually, they might be sealed or converted to some other purpose, but for now, they stood as reminders of what had been endured and what had been overcome, of the darkness that humanity could inflict and the light that courage could bring. And above ground, under the stars that had watched empires rise and fall across Africa's landscapes for millennia, Burkina Faso continued its journey toward the future it was building for itself, one operation, one decision, one day at a time. The end.